The blood trickled down Elizabeth Foster's chin as she clutched her swollen cheek, stumbling through the twilight shadows of Gila Bend, Arizona. The year was 1878, and as the desert wind whistled through the scattered buildings of the frontier town, she knew that tonight she had to escape or die trying. Her husband's rage had never been this dangerous before, and the knife in his hand had made his intentions terrifyingly clear. The moon hung high above the dusty Main Street as Elizabeth limped toward the edge of town, her ragged breathing matching her uneven footsteps. She wore only a thin cotton dress, torn at the sleeve where Jeremiah had grabbed her. The bruises on her arms were turning purple in the moonlight, but it was the cut on her temple that worried her most, bleeding steadily despite her attempts to staunch it with her sleeve. When she heard the hoofbeats behind her, Elizabeth's heart nearly stopped. She ducked behind a water trough, praying that Jeremiah hadn't spotted her escape from their small house at the edge of town. But instead of her husband's drunken shouts, she heard a different voice, low, calm, and unfamiliar. "Madam, are you hurt? I can see you there." Elizabeth remained frozen, trapped between fear of this stranger and terror of what awaited her at home. The rider dismounted, his spurs jingling softly as his boots hit the dirt. She could see him now, tall and broad-shouldered, his face shadowed by his wide-brimmed hat. He approached slowly, hands visible, as if approaching a wounded animal. "I don't mean you any harm," he said softly. When he stepped into the moonlight, she saw a man perhaps 30 years old with kind eyes and a weathered face. "I'm Daniel Grayson. I've got a ranch outside town." "Please," Elizabeth whispered. "I need to keep moving. He'll find me." Daniel took another step closer, and the moonlight fell across Elizabeth's face, illuminating her injuries. His expression hardened. "Your husband did this," Elizabeth nodded, touching her fingertips to the cut on her temple. They came away red. Daniel Grayson's jaw tightened as he surveyed the damage. "That was the very last time," he said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "I promise you that, madam." "You don't understand," Elizabeth said, struggling to her feet. "Jeremiah is the deputy. No one will stop him." Daniel removed his bandana and gently pressed it against the cut on her temple. "I'm not no one, madam, but first we need to get you somewhere safe." He gestured to his horse. "My ranch is about 5 miles outside town. You'll be safe there tonight." Elizabeth hesitated, weighing her limited options. Running alone into the desert night would likely be a death sentence. Going back to Jeremiah certainly would be. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," Daniel replied. "And I've seen enough men like your husband to know what comes next if you stay." He extended his hand. "Please, let me help you." The sound of distant shouting made Elizabeth's decision for her. She took Daniel's hand and let him help her onto his horse. The pain of her injuries made mounting difficult, but fear gave her strength. Daniel swung up behind her, keeping a respectful distance while still supporting her swaying form. "Hold on, madam. We're going to ride fast until we're well away from town." "Elizabeth," she whispered as they began to move. "Elizabeth Foster." "Miss Elizabeth," Daniel acknowledged, guiding his horse into a canter away from Gila Bend and the life she was leaving behind. They rode in silence for nearly an hour, the horse's steady rhythm and the vast starry sky above offering Elizabeth a strange sense of peace despite her circumstances. The bleeding from her temple had slowed, though her whole body ached from Jeremiah's attack. "It's just over that rise," Daniel finally said, pointing to a small hill ahead. "Not much to look at, but it's mine." As they crested the hill, Elizabeth saw a modest ranch house with a barn and corral nearby. A lantern burned in the window, casting a warm glow into the night. "My ranch hand, Miguel, lives in the small cabin out back," Daniel explained as they approached. "He's trustworthy." Been with me since I started this place 3 years ago." He helped Elizabeth down from the horse, steadying her when her legs threatened to buckle beneath her. The door to the house opened, and an older woman with silver-streaked dark hair stepped onto the porch. "Daniel, what's all this?" she called, then gasped when she saw Elizabeth's condition. "Good Lord, bring her in right away. This is Mrs. Rosario Garcia," Daniel explained. "She keeps house for me, and she's the finest cook in the territory." "Enough flattery," Mrs. Garcia scolded, ushering them inside. "This poor girl needs tending. Bring her to the spare room." Elizabeth found herself guided to a small but clean bedroom. Mrs. Garcia immediately began fussing, gathering water, cloth, and what looked like a medicine box. "I'll leave you in Mrs. Garcia's capable hands," Daniel said from the doorway. "I need to see to my horse. You're safe here, Miss Elizabeth. I give you my word." As he turned to go, Elizabeth called after him, "Mr. Grayson." When he paused, she continued, "Thank you. I had nowhere else to go." Daniel nodded. "Get some rest. We'll talk more tomorrow." After he left, Mrs. Garcia helped Elizabeth out of her torn dress and into a clean nightgown. The older woman's hands were gentle but efficient as she cleaned and dressed Elizabeth's wounds. "That husband of yours," Mrs. Garcia said, applying salve to a particularly nasty bruise on Elizabeth's arm, "he should be strung up." Elizabeth tensed. "How did you know?" "Seen it before, child." "Too many times." Mrs. Garcia shook her head sadly. "I worked as a midwife in Tucson for 20 years before coming to work for Mr. Grayson. I know what a husband's fists can do." She finished wrapping a bandage around Elizabeth's temple. "But you're safe now. Mr. Grayson is a good man." "I can't stay," Elizabeth said, wincing as she shifted on the bed. "Jeremiah will come looking, and I don't want to bring trouble to your door." Mrs. Garcia patted her hand. "That's tomorrow's worry. Tonight you rest." Despite her fear, exhaustion swept over Elizabeth like a wave. The clean sheets and soft pillow were a luxury after months of terror, never knowing when Jeremiah's next outburst would come. As she drifted toward sleep, she heard Mrs. Garcia and Daniel speaking in low voices in the hallway. "It's bad, Daniel," Mrs. Garcia was saying. "That man is an animal." "I know," came Daniel's reply, "but she'll be safe here. The deputy will come looking. You know that. Let him come." Their voices faded as Elizabeth surrendered to exhaustion, sleeping deeply for the first time in months. Morning sunlight streamed through the window when Elizabeth woke. For a moment, she was disoriented, the unfamiliar room and the absence of fear confusing her. Then the pain in her body reminded her of everything that had happened. A soft knock at the door preceded Mrs. Garcia's entrance with a tray of food. "Good morning, child. I've brought you breakfast." "How are you feeling?" "Sore," Elizabeth admitted, "but better. Thank you for your kindness." "Eat," Mrs. Garcia said, setting the tray on Elizabeth's lap. "You need your strength." The breakfast of eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits was the most delicious thing Elizabeth had tasted in ages. Jeremiah had often withheld food as punishment, and she hadn't realized how hungry she was until now. "Where is Mr. Grayson?" Elizabeth asked between bites. "He rode out at dawn to check the north pasture. He'll be back midday." Mrs. Garcia busied herself tidying the room. "He left some clothes for you. They belonged to his sister when she visited last year. They might be a bit large, but they'll do until we can get you something proper." Elizabeth set down her fork. "Mrs. Garcia, I can't stay. You and Mr. Grayson have been so kind, but Jeremiah is the deputy. He'll come with the law on his side." Mrs. Garcia's expression hardened. "The law? The law says a man can't beat his wife half to death. The law says a woman has the right to safety." She sat on the edge of the bed. "Daniel spoke with Sheriff Tate last night after you fell asleep. Rode all the way back to town." Elizabeth's heart raced. "What happened?" The sheriff isn't blind to what Jeremiah Foster has been doing. He's been looking for a way to remove him as deputy for months, but the mayor, who is Jeremiah's uncle, as you know, has protected him. Mrs. Garcia's eyes were kind but determined. Sheriff Tate says you can stay here while he builds a case against your husband. You're not the first woman Jeremiah has hurt. But not the first wife, Elizabeth said quietly. I didn't know. When I married him, he was so charming, so attentive. It wasn't until after the wedding that he changed. Mrs. Garcia nodded knowingly. Men like that, they wear masks until they have you trapped. She stood up. Rest today. Tomorrow, if you're feeling stronger, you can help me around the house. Mr. Grayson won't accept payment for helping you, but I know he'd appreciate not having to eat my cooking every day. This brought a small smile to Elizabeth's face. Your cooking is wonderful. Pa, I make the same 5 dishes over and over. That man needs variety. Mrs. Garcia collected the breakfast tray. There's a dress in the wardrobe when you're ready to get up. After Mrs. Garcia left, Elizabeth carefully rose from bed. Her body protested, but she managed to wash with the basin of water provided and dress in the simple blue calico dress from the wardrobe. It was indeed a bit large, but clean and whole, unlike the torn and bloodied dress she'd arrived in. Elizabeth made her way slowly to the main room of the ranch house. It was simply furnished but comfortable, with a stone fireplace, a dining table, and several well-worn armchairs. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with more books than Elizabeth had seen outside the schoolhouse. She ran her fingers along the spines: novels, poetry, history, science. Jeremiah had forbidden books in their home, claiming they gave women ideas above their station. He reads every night, Mrs. Garcia said, appearing in the doorway. Mr. Grayson, educated himself after his parents died, says a man's mind needs feeding just like his body. I haven't read a book in over a year, Elizabeth admitted, carefully removing a volume of Tennyson's poetry. Then read, Mrs. Garcia said with a smile. The rocking chair by the window gets the best light. Elizabeth spent the morning lost in poetry, the rhythmic motion of the rocking chair soothing her troubled mind. Around midday, she heard hoofbeats approaching and tensed automatically, the fear of Jeremiah ingrained in her very bones. Mrs. Garcia patted her shoulder reassuringly. It's just Daniel returning. Daniel Grayson entered the house a few minutes later, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. He looked tired but smiled when he saw Elizabeth. Miss Elizabeth, he greeted her. It's good to see you up. How are you feeling? Better, thank you, she replied, closing the book of poetry. Mr. Grayson, Mrs. Garcia told me you spoke with Sheriff Tate. I don't know how to thank you for your kindness. Daniel shook his head. No thanks needed. The sheriff's a good man. He's been wanting to remove your husband from his position for some time. He sat in the chair across from her. I hope you'll consider staying here until matters are settled. You'd be doing me a favor, actually. Mrs. Garcia could use the help, and this house could use a woman's touch. Elizabeth noticed for the first time that while clean and orderly, the house did lack certain comforts that a woman might add: curtains, cushions, the small touches that made a house a home. I can sew, Elizabeth offered. And I was a teacher before I married Jeremiah. I could help with correspondence or bookkeeping. Daniel's expression brightened. A teacher? That's mighty fortunate. I've been meaning to organize my accounts better. He rubbed the back of his neck. Mrs. Garcia says I run this ranch like a man who can't count past 10. This brought a genuine laugh from Elizabeth, perhaps her first in months. The sound surprised her, and she quickly covered her mouth. No, don't, Daniel said gently. It's a nice sound. This house could use more laughter. Their eyes met briefly, and Elizabeth felt a strange flutter in her chest, not fear, but something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She quickly looked away. "Mrs. Garcia mentioned you have cattle," she said, changing the subject. "How large is your ranch?" Daniel seemed to understand her need to move to safer topics. "About 2,000 acres. Not the biggest spread in the territory, but it's good land with reliable water. I run about 500 head of cattle, and we're doing well enough that I've hired 2 more hands besides Miguel." "That's impressive for just 3 years," Elizabeth remarked. "I had a good start," Daniel admitted. "My parents left me some money when they passed. Consumption took them both within a month of each other. I was back east then, working in my uncle's law office, but I never had the temperament for city life or legal work. I came west, bought this land, and started building." He smiled ruefully. "Made every mistake a man can make that first year, but I learned." Mrs. Garcia entered with a tray of sandwiches and coffee. "Enough talk of business. Eat, both of you." The 3 of them shared a simple but pleasant meal. Elizabeth found herself relaxing in their company, though she still startled at unexpected sounds. After lunch, Daniel excused himself to return to his work, and Elizabeth helped Mrs. Garcia with household chores, grateful for the normalcy of the tasks. That evening, Daniel returned with a small package, which he somewhat awkwardly presented to Elizabeth. "I sent Miguel into town for supplies," he explained as she unwrapped the brown paper to reveal a hairbrush, comb, and small mirror. "I thought you might need these things." The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought tears to Elizabeth's eyes. Such simple items, but they represented a kind of care she hadn't experienced in far too long. "Thank you," she said softly. "This is very kind." Daniel shifted uncomfortably, not used to a woman's tears. "It's nothing, really, just practical items." Mrs. Garcia rolled her eyes at his discomfort. "Men, they think tears are always sad." She shooed Daniel toward the door. "Go wash up for dinner and give the poor woman a moment." After dinner, they sat in the main room while Daniel read aloud from a collection of Mark Twain stories. Elizabeth mended a shirt of Daniel's that Mrs. Garcia had set aside, enjoying the simple domesticity of the evening. It reminded her of her childhood home before her parents died and left her alone in the world, vulnerable to Jeremiah's false promises of security and affection. As the days passed, Elizabeth's body healed faster than her spirit. The bruises faded from purple to yellow, and the cut on her temple scabbed over and began to heal. Each day brought a little more strength, a little more confidence. She began to help more around the ranch, not just with household tasks but with the bookkeeping Daniel had mentioned. His account books were indeed in disarray, but Elizabeth found satisfaction in bringing order to the chaos. Daniel was impressed with her skill and often sought her advice on matters of business. Their conversations grew longer and more comfortable as they discovered shared interests in literature, history, and even politics, a subject Jeremiah had deemed entirely unsuitable for a woman's mind. A week after her arrival at the ranch, Sheriff Tate rode out to speak with Elizabeth. Daniel insisted on being present for the conversation, which took place in the main room of the house. "Mrs. Foster," Sheriff Tate began, hat in his hands, "I want to first say how sorry I am for what you've endured. I should have acted sooner against Deputy Foster." "You couldn't have known," Elizabeth replied, though part of her wondered if the whole town had been aware of her suffering. "I suspected," the sheriff admitted, "but without a complaint and with the mayor protecting him." He shook his head. "That's no excuse. I'm the law in Gila Bend and I failed you." Daniel, sitting beside Elizabeth, spoke up. "What matters now is what happens next, Sheriff." Sheriff Tate nodded. "That's why I'm here. Mrs. Foster, I need your testimony about the abuse. I've gathered statements from Dr. Morgan about treating your previous injuries and from neighbors who heard disturbances, but your account is crucial." Elizabeth's hands trembled in her lap. "If I testify against him, what will happen?" "He'll stand trial," the sheriff said. "With your testimony and the other evidence, I believe he'll be convicted and imprisoned. At the very least, he'll lose his badge." "And if I don't testify?" The sheriff's expression grew grave. "Then he remains deputy and legally, you're still his wife. He could demand your return, and I'd have no grounds to refuse him." Elizabeth closed her eyes, fear washing over her at the thought of returning to Jeremiah. She felt a warm hand cover hers and opened her eyes to find Daniel looking at her with steady resolve. "You don't have to face this alone," he said quietly. Drawing strength from his support, Elizabeth turned back to the sheriff. "I'll testify. I won't live in fear any longer." Sheriff Tate looked relieved. "Thank you, Mrs. Foster. I'll need a written statement today and then your presence at the hearing next week in Tucson." "Tucson?" Elizabeth asked, surprised. "Judge Holbrook is circuit judge. He's in Tucson next week. I thought it best to have the hearing there, away from the mayor's influence." The sheriff pulled out a notebook. "Now, if you're ready, I need to ask you some difficult questions." For the next hour, Elizabeth recounted the nightmare of her marriage, the initial charm that had won her heart, the gradual control Jeremiah exerted over her life, and finally the escalating violence. She described incidents of being struck, pushed, and threatened, culminating in the final attack when Jeremiah had come home drunk and flown into a rage over a missing button on his shirt. Daniel remained by her side throughout, his presence a silent comfort. When she described how Jeremiah had held a knife to her throat, Daniel's hand tightened on hers, but he said nothing, allowing her to tell her story in her own words. When it was done, Sheriff Tate had filled several pages with notes. "This is more than enough, Mrs. Foster. I'll have formal papers drawn up for you to sign before the hearing." He closed his notebook. "I should warn you, Jeremiah has been making threats. He's claiming you were unfaithful and that's why he disciplined you." Elizabeth gasped. "That's a lie. I know," the sheriff said gently. "No one believes him. But he's desperate, and desperate men are dangerous. I've forbidden him to come near this ranch, but I'd advise caution." After the sheriff left, Elizabeth felt drained. The recounting of her ordeal had reopened emotional wounds, and she excused herself to rest in her room. As she lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, there was a soft knock at the door. "Elizabeth, it's Daniel. May I speak with you?" She sat up, wiping away tears. "Yes, come in." Daniel entered, carrying a cup of tea. "Mrs. Garcia thought you might need this." He set the cup on the bedside table and remained standing, looking somewhat uncomfortable. "I wanted to say how much I admire your courage today, speaking about such things. It couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't," Elizabeth admitted, "but it feels as though a weight has been lifted. For so long I've carried the shame of his actions as if they were my fault." "They were never your fault," Daniel said firmly. "Never think that." Elizabeth smiled sadly. "It's hard not to. A wife is supposed to make her husband happy to keep the peace." "No," Daniel shook his head. "A marriage is a partnership. Both people are responsible for the happiness of the other." He hesitated, then added, "My parents showed me that. They had their disagreements, but there was always respect, always love." "You were fortunate," Elizabeth said. "My parents died when I was 16. I had no family left, no home. When Jeremiah courted me, he seemed so strong, so capable. He promised to take care of me." Her voice broke. "I was so naive." Daniel sat carefully on the edge of the bed, maintaining a respectful distance. "You were young and alone. He took advantage of that." He looked down at his hands. "I've been thinking, Elizabeth. After the hearing, when you're free of him legally, what will you do?" The question caught Elizabeth by surprise. She hadn't allowed herself to think that far ahead, too afraid to hope for a future beyond Jeremiah's control. I don't know, she admitted. I could perhaps return to teaching or find work as a housekeeper. You could stay here, Daniel said, the words coming out in a rush. Not as a housekeeper, as, well, I'm not expressing this well. He stood and paced the small room. What I mean to say is, I've grown very fond of you these past days. I know it's too soon to speak of such things with all you've been through. But I want you to know that you have a place here, for as long as you wish, with no obligations. Elizabeth felt her heart quicken. She'd noticed her own growing feelings for Daniel, his kindness, his quiet strength, his respect for her mind and opinions. But she'd pushed those feelings aside, certain they were merely gratitude for his rescue. Daniel, she said softly, I don't know what to say. I'm still married, still bound to a man who I know, he interrupted. I'm not asking for anything now, just telling you that there's a future here if you want it, when you're ready, if you're ever ready. He moved toward the door. Rest now. We'll speak no more of this until after the hearing. After he left, Elizabeth sipped the tea and contemplated his words. The idea of a future, a real future, with a man who treated her with respect and kindness, seemed almost too much to hope for. Yet for the first time since Jeremiah had shown his true nature, Elizabeth allowed herself to imagine happiness might be possible again. The days leading up to the hearing in Tucson passed quickly. Elizabeth continued helping with the ranch accounts and began teaching Miguel's 2 young children to read in the afternoons. The routine gave her purpose and helped keep her mind off the upcoming confrontation with Jeremiah. Daniel was true to his word and made no further mention of his feelings, though Elizabeth often caught him watching her with a warmth that made her blush. They continued their evening ritual of reading aloud, and sometimes Daniel would play the harmonica while Elizabeth and Mrs. Garcia sang old hymns and folk songs. The night before they were to leave for Tucson, Elizabeth sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Daniel joined her, offering a shawl against the evening chill. Beautiful, isn't it? He said, nodding toward the horizon. It is, Elizabeth agreed. I never noticed the sunsets when I lived in town. I was always inside by this hour preparing Jeremiah's dinner. Daniel leaned against the porch rail. Are you nervous about tomorrow? Terrified, Elizabeth admitted. Not just of seeing Jeremiah again, but of speaking in front of the judge, of having everyone hear my shame. It's his shame, not yours, Daniel reminded her, and I'll be right there with you. Elizabeth looked up at him, this man who had come to mean so much to her in such a short time. Why are you doing all this for me, Daniel? You hardly knew me that night in town. You could have ridden past, minded your own business. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fading light. My sister, he finally said. Sarah. She married a man like Jeremiah back east. I was working in California when it happened. By the time I received her letters describing her fear, it was too late. His voice grew rough with emotion. He killed her, Elizabeth, beat her to death and claimed she fell down the stairs. The local sheriff believed him. No trial, no justice. Oh, Daniel, Elizabeth whispered, reaching for his hand. I'm so sorry. When I saw you that night bleeding and afraid, he shook his head. I couldn't ride past. I couldn't fail another woman the way I failed Sarah. Elizabeth stood and moved closer to him. You didn't fail her, Daniel. You didn't know. I should have known. I should have been there. He looked down at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. But I can be here now for you. And I promise you, Elizabeth, Jeremiah Foster will never hurt you again. The intensity of his promise should have frightened her, but instead, Elizabeth felt only safety and gratitude. Impulsively, she rose on tiptoe and kissed his cheek. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. Daniel looked startled by the gesture, then smiled softly. We should get some rest. It's a long ride to Tucson tomorrow. They set out at dawn the next day, Daniel driving a small wagon he'd borrowed from a neighboring rancher. Mrs. Garcia had packed them food for the journey and fresh clothes for Elizabeth to wear to the hearing. Sheriff Tate rode alongside them, his presence a reminder of both the seriousness of their journey and the protection it offered. The trip to Tucson took most of the day, and they arrived in time to check into rooms at a modest hotel near the courthouse. The sheriff had arranged for Elizabeth to have a room between his and Daniel's, ensuring her safety. "The hearing is at 9 tomorrow morning," Sheriff Tate informed them in the hotel dining room that evening. "Judge Holbrook is a fair man. He'll hear your testimony, Mrs. Foster, along with the other evidence I've gathered. Jeremiah will have a chance to speak in his own defense, but with the doctor's testimony about your previous injuries, I believe the judge will rule in your favor." "What about the mayor?" Daniel asked. "Will he try to intervene?" "Mayor Foster is in Phoenix on business," the sheriff replied. "Convenient timing, if you ask me. I think he knows his nephew has gone too far this time." Elizabeth picked at her food, her appetite diminished by anxiety about the coming day. "Will I have to speak directly to Jeremiah?" "No," Sheriff Tate assured her. "You'll address the judge. Your husband Jeremiah will be present, but he won't be permitted to approach you." Despite the sheriff's reassurances, Elizabeth slept poorly that night, plagued by nightmares of Jeremiah's rage. When morning came, she dressed carefully in the navy blue dress Mrs. Garcia had altered for her, trying to project a composure she did not feel. Daniel knocked on her door at 8:30. When she opened it, his appreciative gaze gave her a moment's confidence. "You look very proper, Miss Elizabeth," he said. "The judge will see a respectable woman who has been greatly wronged." The courthouse was already busy when they arrived. Sheriff Tate led them to a small waiting room where a bespectacled man introduced himself as Mr. Howard, the county prosecutor who would be presenting the case against Jeremiah. "Mrs. Foster," he said, shaking her hand, "your courage in coming forward is admirable. I've reviewed Sheriff Tate's notes and the doctor's testimony. We have a strong case against your husband." "Ex-husband, God willing," Elizabeth murmured. Mr. Howard nodded sympathetically. "The judge will likely grant your petition for divorce on grounds of cruelty. Given Deputy Foster's position of authority, the judge may also impose criminal penalties." Elizabeth's hands twisted nervously in her lap. "Will that mean prison?" "Possibly," Mr. Howard replied. "Or removal from office and a fine at minimum. Judge Holbrook takes abuse of power very seriously." A court officer appeared at the door. "The judge is ready. Mrs. Foster, if you'll come with me." Elizabeth rose on shaky legs. Daniel stepped forward, offering his arm for support. "I'll be right behind you," he promised. The courtroom was smaller than Elizabeth had imagined, with perhaps 30 seats for spectators, most already filled. Judge Holbrook, a stern-faced man with white hair and bushy eyebrows, sat behind a raised desk at the front. And there, at a table to one side, was Jeremiah. Elizabeth faltered at the sight of him. He was clean-shaven and dressed in his deputy's uniform, looking every inch the respectable lawman. His gaze locked with hers, and the hatred in his eyes made her shiver. Daniel's hand pressed reassuringly against the small of her back. "Remember, he can't hurt you here," he whispered. The hearing proceeded with formal efficiency. Mr. Howard presented the case against Jeremiah, introducing the doctor's written testimony about treating Elizabeth's injuries on 3 separate occasions in the past year. A neighbor testified to hearing screams and the sounds of violence from the Foster home. Then it was Elizabeth's turn. She took the witness chair, swore to tell the truth, and faced the judge. "Mrs. Foster," Mr. Howard began, "please tell the court about your marriage to Deputy Jeremiah Foster." Elizabeth took a deep breath and began to speak. She described meeting Jeremiah when she was a young teacher, new to Gila Bend, and how his courtship had been respectful and proper. She explained how his behavior changed after their wedding, becoming controlling and then violent. "The first time he struck me was 3 months after we were married," she said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "I had burned the bread at dinner. He slapped me across the face, then immediately apologized, promising it would never happen again. But it did happen again." Mr. Howard prompted. "Yes," Elizabeth continued. "With increasing frequency. Any small mistake, a wrinkled shirt, dinner served too late, speaking to another man on the street could trigger his rage. He began to control who I could speak to when I could leave the house. He forced me to quit my teaching position, saying a deputy's wife should not work." As she described the escalating violence, Elizabeth kept her eyes on the judge, avoiding looking at Jeremiah. Judge Holbrook listened intently, occasionally making notes but never interrupting. "And the night you left," Mr. Howard said, "can you describe what happened?" Elizabeth recounted that final night, Jeremiah returning home drunk, exploding in rage over a missing button, striking her repeatedly, and finally pulling his knife and threatening to teach her a lesson she'd never forget. "I truly believed he would kill me," she concluded. "When he passed out from the whiskey, I fled. That's when Mr. Grayson found me and offered sanctuary at his ranch." Mr. Howard thanked her and turned the questioning over to Jeremiah's lawyer, a nervous young man named Collins who seemed uncomfortable with his client. "Mrs. Foster," he began, "is it not true that my client provided well for you materially? A good home, food, clothing." "The house belonged to his family," Elizabeth replied. "And yes, there was food and basic clothing, but a gilded cage is still a cage, Mr. Collins." The young lawyer shifted tactics. "Did you ever strike Deputy Foster? Provoke him in any way?" Elizabeth met his gaze steadily. "No, sir. I lived in fear of provoking him, so I was careful never to raise my voice or contradict him in any way." "And yet he still became violent," Mr. Collins stated, more a comment than a question. "Yes, because his violence wasn't about my behavior. It was about his need for control." Mr. Collins had no further questions, and Elizabeth was allowed to step down. She returned to her seat beside Daniel, who squeezed her hand in silent support. Then it was Jeremiah's turn. He took the stand with the confident swagger that had once seemed attractive to Elizabeth, but now revealed his arrogance. "Deputy Foster," his lawyer began, "how do you respond to your wife's accusations?" Jeremiah straightened his uniform jacket. "It pains me deeply to hear Elizabeth distort our marriage in this way. I have always been a devoted husband. Yes, we had disagreements as all married couples do. And yes, there were times when I had to exercise my authority as her husband to correct her behavior." "Did you strike your wife?" Mr. Collins asked. "I may have disciplined her on occasion," Jeremiah admitted, "but never without cause. Elizabeth has a tendency toward hysteria and exaggeration. The injuries she describes were largely self-inflicted during her fits of temper." Elizabeth gasped at the blatant lie. Daniel's arm went around her shoulders protectively. "As for the night she ran away," Jeremiah continued, "I had discovered evidence of her infidelity. When confronted, she became violent and I restrained her to prevent her from harming herself or me. I never threatened her with a knife." "And where did she go after leaving your home?" Mr. Collins asked. Jeremiah's gaze shifted to Daniel, hatred evident in his eyes. "To the ranch of Daniel Grayson, a man who has had his eye on my wife for some time. The fact that she went straight to him proves her infidelity." Mr. Howard was on his feet immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. Deputy Foster is making unfounded accusations against Mrs. Foster and Mr. Grayson." "Sustained," Judge Holbrook said. Deputy Foster, confine your testimony to facts, not conjecture. The questioning continued, with Jeremiah painting himself as the victim of a hysterical, unfaithful wife and a covetous neighbor. But his story was full of contradictions, and under Mr. Howard's cross-examination, he became increasingly defensive and angry. "If you care for your wife as you claim," Mr. Howard asked, "why did you not report her missing that night? Why did Sheriff Tate have to inform you the next day that she was safe?" "I assumed she'd gone to cool off," Jeremiah replied. "She's done it before." "Gone where exactly?" "You testified earlier that you controlled where she went and who she spoke to." Jeremiah's face darkened. "I protected her. This town is no place for a woman alone." "Yet you left her alone, bleeding, that night," Mr. Howard pressed, "after disciplining her, as you put it." "She's my wife," Jeremiah snapped, his composure finally cracking. "I can do what I want with her. The law says so." A murmur ran through the courtroom at this outburst. Judge Holbrook banged his gavel for order. "The law does not say that, Deputy Foster," the judge said sternly. "The law does not condone abuse, regardless of marital status." After Jeremiah stepped down, Dr. Morgan's written testimony was read into the record, detailing 3 separate occasions when he had treated Elizabeth for injuries consistent with beating bruised ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and a concussion. Finally, Sheriff Tate testified about finding blood in the Foster home the morning after Elizabeth fled, contradicting Jeremiah's claim that he had merely restrained her. Judge Holbrook called a brief recess before rendering his decision. Elizabeth remained in the courtroom, unwilling to risk encountering Jeremiah in the hallway. Daniel stayed by her side, his presence a shield against the stares of the curious spectators. When the judge returned, the courtroom fell silent. "In the matter of Foster versus Foster," Judge Holbrook began, "I have heard testimony and reviewed evidence regarding Mrs. Elizabeth Foster's petition for divorce on grounds of extreme cruelty, as well as the criminal charges against Deputy Jeremiah Foster for assault and battery." He looked directly at Elizabeth. "Mrs. Foster, the court finds your testimony credible and supported by independent evidence. Your petition for divorce is granted, effective immediately. You may resume your maiden name if you wish." Relief washed over Elizabeth like a cool rain. Free. She was free. "As to the criminal charges against Deputy Foster," the judge continued, turning his stern gaze to Jeremiah, "this court finds you guilty of assault and battery against your now former wife. Your position as a deputy makes this offense particularly egregious, as you have violated not only your marriage vows but also your oath to uphold the law." Jeremiah stood rigid, his face contorted with anger. "I sentence you to 1 year in the territorial prison, after which you will be permanently barred from holding any position of public authority. You are also ordered to pay restitution of $100 to Elizabeth Foster for medical expenses and suffering." "This is an outrage," Jeremiah shouted. "She's my wife. She belongs to me. Remove the prisoner," Judge Holbrook ordered, and 2 court officers moved to take Jeremiah into custody. As they approached, Jeremiah suddenly lunged across the courtroom toward Elizabeth. "You whore," he snarled. "You'll pay for this." Daniel stepped in front of Elizabeth protectively as Sheriff Tate, and the court officers grabbed Jeremiah, restraining him as he continued to shout threats. "Add contempt of court to the charges," Judge Holbrook ordered, banging his gavel, "and increase the sentence to 18 months. As Jeremiah was dragged from the courtroom, still shouting obscenities, Elizabeth found herself trembling uncontrollably. It was over. She had won her freedom, but the hatred in Jeremiah's eyes told her he would never truly let her go. Daniel's arm was around her waist, supporting her. "It's done," he said softly. "You're free, Elizabeth," Mr. Howard approached, offering his hand. "Congratulations, miss. Do you wish to revert to your maiden name?" Elizabeth nodded. "Yes, Elizabeth Fletcher. Thank you for your help, Mr. Howard." "The judge has expedited the paperwork," Mr. Howard informed her. "You can collect the final divorce decree tomorrow morning. The clerk will also have papers regarding Deputy Foster's restitution payment." Outside the courthouse, the bright Arizona sunshine seemed to symbolize the new beginning Elizabeth had been granted. Sheriff Tate shook her hand firmly. "You showed great courage today, Miss Fletcher. Jeremiah won't be able to hurt anyone else for at least 18 months, and without his badge, his power in Gila Bend is broken." "What will happen to him after prison?" Elizabeth asked. "Men like him don't change," the sheriff said bluntly. "But he won't be welcome in Gila Bend, and I'll make sure every sheriff in the territory knows his history. He'll find it hard to establish himself anywhere nearby." As they walked back to the hotel, Daniel was unusually quiet. Elizabeth glanced at him questioningly. "Is something wrong?" "I thought you'd be pleased with the outcome." "I am," Daniel assured her. "Very pleased. You were magnificent in there, Elizabeth, so strong and clear." "Then why do you look troubled?" Daniel sighed. "The things Jeremiah said about us, about your coming to my ranch. I'm worried he's damaged your reputation." Elizabeth stopped walking and turned to face him. "Daniel Grayson, are you concerned about gossip after everything else that's happened?" "Not for myself," Daniel clarified. "For you. A woman's reputation is precious in these parts." "My reputation was being beaten by my husband," Elizabeth said bluntly. "I'd rather be the subject of gossip for finding sanctuary with a kind man than live one more day under Jeremiah's fists." Daniel's expression softened. "You truly are remarkable, Elizabeth Fletcher." That evening, they ate dinner at a small restaurant near the hotel, celebrating Elizabeth's freedom. Sheriff Tate joined them, raising a toast to justice served and new beginnings. As they lingered over coffee, the sheriff excused himself to send a telegram to his deputy in Gila Bend, leaving Daniel and Elizabeth alone. "What will you do now?" Daniel asked, echoing the question he had posed days earlier. "Will you return to teaching?" Elizabeth considered the question carefully. "I'm not sure Gila Bend is the right place for me anymore. Too many painful memories." She glanced up at him. "But I've grown fond of the area around your ranch. Perhaps there might be a teaching position nearby." "The closest school is 15 miles away," Daniel said. "But there are enough children within riding distance of the ranch to justify a small schoolhouse. I've thought of building one, actually." "Have you?" Elizabeth asked, surprised. Daniel nodded. "Miguel's children aren't the only ones needing education. There's the Henderson place with their 4 young ones, the Wilsons with 3, and several other families within a few miles." He smiled. "I just didn't have a teacher." "Are you offering me a position, Mr. Grayson?" Elizabeth asked, a smile playing at her lips. "I'm offering you whatever you want, Elizabeth," Daniel replied seriously. "A teaching position, a place to live, or—" He hesitated. "I meant what I said before. I've grown very fond of you, more than fond. But I understand if it's too soon, after everything you've been through." Elizabeth reached across the table to take his hand. "When I married Jeremiah, I was young, alone, and desperate for security. I confused his controlling nature with strength, his jealousy with love." She met Daniel's eyes steadily. "I won't make that mistake again, but in these past weeks I've seen what a good man truly is. You've shown me kindness without condition, respect without demand, and strength without cruelty." "Are you saying—" Daniel began, hope evident in his voice. "I'm saying I need time," Elizabeth replied gently. "Time to know my own mind and heart without fear clouding my judgment. But I would like to stay at the ranch if the offer still stands. perhaps as your school teacher for now." Daniel's face broke into a broad smile. "The offer stands, Miss Fletcher, for as long as you wish." They returned to the ranch 2 days later, the divorce decree safely secured in Elizabeth's belongings. Mrs. Garcia welcomed them with a hearty meal and keen interest in the court proceedings, which Elizabeth recounted over dinner. "So you're a free woman now," Mrs. Garcia said, satisfaction evident in her tone. "And that monster is where he belongs, behind bars." "Yes," Elizabeth agreed, "though sometimes I still find myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see him." "That will fade with time, Mrs. Garcia assured her. "And meanwhile, you're safe here." The next few weeks established a new routine. Daniel cleared out a small, unused building near the main house, converting it into a one-room schoolhouse. Word spread quickly among the neighboring ranches, and within a month, Elizabeth was teaching 12 children of various ages, from Miguel's 6-year-old daughter to the Hendersons' teenage son. She found joy in teaching again, and purpose in building a curriculum suited to the needs of ranch children. Daniel supplied books and materials generously, often sitting in during lessons when his work allowed, apparently fascinated by her teaching methods. In the evenings, they continued their habit of reading together, though now they were often joined by Miguel's family and occasionally other neighbors. The ranch became a gathering place, with Elizabeth's presence bringing a warmth and sociability that had been lacking before. As spring turned to summer, Elizabeth found herself completely at home on the ranch. The nightmares about Jeremiah became less frequent, and she moved with increasing confidence around the property and into town when necessary. Sheriff Tate made a point of visiting regularly, both to assure her of Jeremiah's continued imprisonment and to enjoy Mrs. Garcia's cooking. One evening in late July, Daniel invited Elizabeth for a ride to see a special spot on the ranch. They set out as the heat of the day began to wane, Elizabeth now comfortable on horseback after months of practice. "It's just over this rise," Daniel said, leading the way up a gentle slope covered with desert wildflowers. "I found it when I first bought the property." As they crested the hill, Elizabeth gasped. Below them lay a small, hidden valley with a clear spring feeding a pond surrounded by cottonwood trees, an oasis in the desert landscape. The setting sun bathed everything in golden light, reflecting off the water. "It's beautiful," she breathed as they dismounted. "I had no idea this was here." "Few people do," Daniel replied, spreading a blanket beneath one of the cottonwoods. "I come here to think sometimes. It reminds me of why I fell in love with this land." They sat side by side, watching the changing colors of the sunset reflected in the pond. After a comfortable silence, Daniel turned to face her. "Elizabeth," he began, his voice gentle but serious, "it's been 4 months since the hearing, 4 months since you became free. I promised to give you time, and I've tried to keep that promise." He took her hand. "But my feelings for you have only grown stronger. I find myself thinking of you constantly, admiring your strength, your kindness, your intelligence." Elizabeth felt her heart quicken. In truth, her own feelings had been developing just as surely. Each day with Daniel had shown her what a truly good man he was: patient, respectful, hardworking, and gentle. The contrast with Jeremiah could not have been more stark. "Daniel," she said softly, "I've been thinking too. About the future, about what I want." She turned to face him fully. "I came to your ranch broken and afraid. You gave me safety when I needed it most. But now I stay not out of necessity but because I want to be here, with you." Hope flared in Daniel's eyes. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying that I've fallen in love with you, Daniel Grayson," Elizabeth interrupted, the words she had been holding back for weeks finally finding voice. "Not out of gratitude or dependence, but because of who you are. Because you've shown me what love should be: patient, kind, and respectful. Daniel's face broke into a radiant smile. I love you too, Elizabeth, more than I can say. He squeezed her hand. I don't want to rush you, but I need to ask, would you consider becoming my wife? Not now if you're not ready, but someday. Elizabeth felt tears of joy spring to her eyes. Not someday, Daniel. Yes, I will marry you. When the time is right, I will proudly become your wife. Daniel lifted her hand to his lips, kissing it reverently. Then, with infinite gentleness, he leaned forward and kissed her lips, a first kiss that held promise rather than possession, love rather than demand. They remained by the pond until the stars came out, talking of their future together. Daniel spoke of expanding the ranch, of building a larger house for the family they might have, of the school becoming a permanent part of the community. There's just one thing, Elizabeth said as they prepared to ride back. I won't be rushed into marriage. I want time to court properly, to be sure of ourselves. Of course, Daniel agreed immediately. We have all the time in the world. They announced their engagement at Sunday dinner the following week, to the surprise of no one. Mrs. Garcia embraced Elizabeth warmly, whispering, I knew from the first day you would heal his heart. The news spread quickly through the scattered community. Most reactions were positive, though Elizabeth overheard whispers in town about the deputy's wife not waiting a decent interval before catching another husband. Such gossip stung, but Daniel's steadfast support and the genuine good wishes of their true friends helped Elizabeth dismiss the small-minded talk. Sheriff Tate made a point of congratulating them publicly in the general store, effectively silencing the worst of the gossips. As summer turned to fall, they settled into the rhythms of ranch life and courtship. Daniel courted her properly, with flowers and small gifts, rides across the property, and occasional trips into Tucson for dinner and the theater. Elizabeth continued teaching, using her salary to create a small nest egg of her own, a security she had lacked in her previous marriage. In November, a letter arrived from the territorial prison warden, informing Elizabeth that Jeremiah had been involved in a fight with another prisoner and had his sentence extended by 6 months. The news brought a complex mixture of relief and anxiety: relief at the longer separation, anxiety at the reminder that eventually he would be free again. Daniel found her on the porch that evening, the letter crumpled in her hand. Bad news? He asked, sitting beside her. Elizabeth handed him the letter. Not exactly. Jeremiah will be in prison longer than expected. Daniel read it quickly. That's good, isn't it? It just reminds me that someday he'll be free, Elizabeth admitted, and his hatred won't have diminished. If anything, it will have grown. Daniel put his arm around her shoulders. When that day comes, we'll face it together. You're not alone anymore, Elizabeth. She leaned against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. I know, and I refuse to let fear of Jeremiah shadow our happiness. She looked up at him with sudden determination. In fact, I think it's time we set a wedding date. Daniel's eyebrows rose in surprise. Are you sure? There's no rush, I'm sure, Elizabeth said firmly. I don't want to wait any longer to begin our life together. How about Christmas? It gives us 6 weeks to prepare, and it would be a wonderful way to end this year and begin the next. Daniel's face broke into a joyful smile. Christmas it is. The weeks leading up to Christmas were filled with preparations. Elizabeth and Mrs. Garcia sewed a wedding dress of cream-colored silk ordered from Tucson. Daniel, with the help of Miguel and the other ranch hands, built a small but charming cottage near the main house, a wedding present for Elizabeth, who had insisted on having her own home rather than moving directly into Daniel's. It's not that I don't want to live with you, she explained when he questioned her decision. But I need to know I have my own place, my own domain, just for a while. Daniel, understanding the importance of independence to Elizabeth after her controlling first marriage, embraced the idea wholeheartedly. The cottage became a symbol of his respect for her autonomy, a place she could retreat to if needed, though both hoped she would spend most nights in the main house as his wife. The wedding was set for Christmas Eve, with Sheriff Tate agreeing to give the bride away and Reverend Hollister coming from Tucson to perform the ceremony. The schoolhouse was transformed with evergreen boughs, candles, and ribbons, becoming a chapel for the occasion. On the morning of Christmas Eve, Elizabeth woke early in her room in the main house. Mrs. Garcia arrived with breakfast and helped her prepare for the day ahead. "Nervous?" the older woman asked as she brushed Elizabeth's hair. "A little," Elizabeth admitted, "but not about marrying Daniel. Just about everything, standing before everyone, being the center of attention." "You've earned this happiness," Mrs. Garcia said firmly. "Every person coming today knows that." As the afternoon approached, Elizabeth dressed in her wedding gown, simple but elegant, with pearl buttons down the back and delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Mrs. Garcia arranged her hair with sprigs of holly berries and white flowers, then stepped back to admire the effect. "You are beautiful, my dear," she said, tears in her eyes. "Daniel is a fortunate man." A knock at the door announced Sheriff Tate's arrival. The lawman looked uncomfortable in his best suit but smiled broadly when he saw Elizabeth. "Miss Fletcher," he said, using the name she had reclaimed, "you're a vision." "Ready to become Mrs. Grayson." "More than ready," Elizabeth replied, taking his offered arm. The short walk to the schoolhouse was magical in the fading afternoon light. Lanterns had been hung along the path, and the clear winter sky was beginning to show the first stars. From inside the schoolhouse, Elizabeth could hear the sound of Miguel's violin playing a gentle melody. Sheriff Tate paused at the door. "I'm honored to stand in for your father today, Elizabeth. He would be proud of the woman you've become." Elizabeth squeezed his arm gratefully. "Thank you for everything, Sheriff. We wouldn't be here today without your help." Inside, the schoolhouse was transformed. The children's desks had been moved aside to create an aisle, lined with candles in glass jars. At the far end stood Reverend Hollister in his formal attire, and beside him, Daniel. Elizabeth's heart swelled at the sight of him. He wore a new black suit, his usually unruly hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaven. But it was the expression of pure adoration in his eyes as she began walking toward him that brought tears to her own. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. They exchanged traditional vows, though Elizabeth chose to omit the word obey, with the Reverend's understanding approval. Daniel placed a gold band on her finger, simple but elegantly engraved with a pattern of intertwined leaves. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Hollister declared. "Mr. Grayson, you may kiss your bride." Daniel's kiss was gentle yet filled with promise, a perfect reflection of the man himself. As they turned to face their small gathering of friends, Elizabeth felt a profound sense of rightness, of having found her true place in the world. The celebration afterward was joyful, with music, dancing, and a feast prepared by Mrs. Garcia and the neighboring women. As midnight approached, Daniel led Elizabeth outside to show her one final wedding surprise. In the yard behind the schoolhouse, illuminated by lanterns, stood a small sleigh hitched to 2 horses. "For our journey home," Daniel explained. "I thought it more fitting than riding horseback on our wedding night." The sleigh ride under the stars, wrapped in warm blankets against the winter chill, was magical. When they reached the main house, Daniel lifted Elizabeth into his arms to carry her over the threshold. "Welcome home, Mrs. Grayson," he said softly. Their wedding night was everything Elizabeth had never experienced in her first marriage: tender, considerate, and filled with genuine passion. Daniel's touch was reverent, his concern for her comfort paramount. For the first time, Elizabeth understood the true meaning of becoming one with another person, a union of equals rather than possession. In the quiet afterward, lying in her husband's arms, Elizabeth felt a peace she had never known before. "I love you, Daniel," she whispered. "Thank you for showing me what marriage should be." Daniel kissed her forehead gently. "I love you too, Elizabeth, and I promise every day to be worthy of your trust and your heart." The new year brought changes to the ranch. With Elizabeth now officially Daniel's wife, they began making plans for the future. The cottage Daniel had built became Elizabeth's schoolhouse office, where she prepared lessons and met with parents. The school itself grew, with 3 more children joining after Christmas. Daniel expanded the cattle operation, buying an adjacent parcel of land and hiring 2 more hands. Elizabeth's organizational skills and bookkeeping transformed the business side of the ranch, bringing greater prosperity than Daniel had achieved on his own. In February, news arrived that changed everything. A letter from the prison warden informed them that Jeremiah Foster had died in a prison fight, stabbed by another inmate during a dispute over a card game. Elizabeth received the news with complex emotions: relief mingled with a strange grief. Not for the man who had abused her, but for the young woman she had been and the dreams she had once invested in their marriage. "Are you all right?" Daniel asked that night as they sat before the fire in their home. "Yes," Elizabeth said after a long moment. "I feel free, truly free for the first time since I met him." "Is that terrible of me?" Daniel took her hand. "No, he made his choices, Elizabeth, and in the end he reaped what he sowed." Elizabeth nodded slowly. "I've been afraid for so long, first of him, then of the day he would be released. Now that fear is gone." She looked up at her husband, the man who had shown her what love truly meant. "I'm ready to look forward now, Daniel, only forward." As spring returned to the desert, Elizabeth discovered she was expecting their first child. The news brought joy to the entire ranch, with Mrs. Garcia immediately beginning to knit baby clothes and Miguel crafting a beautiful wooden cradle. Daniel was ecstatic, treating Elizabeth with such careful solicitude that she finally had to tell him she was pregnant, not made of glass. He laughed but continued to dote on her, reading books on childcare and making plans for the baby's future. The months passed peacefully, the ranch thriving under their joint care. Elizabeth continued teaching until her condition made it impractical, then trained one of the older girls to serve as her assistant. The school had become an integral part of the community, with families from as far as 20 miles away sending their children to learn from Mrs. Grayson's academy, as it had come to be known. In late November 1880, almost a year after their Christmas wedding, Elizabeth gave birth to a son they named Thomas, after Daniel's father. He was a healthy, robust baby with his mother's eyes and his father's determined chin. Holding her son in her arms, with Daniel seated beside her on their bed, Elizabeth marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment of perfect happiness. "Did you ever imagine this, that night you found me bleeding in the street?" she asked softly. Daniel smiled, gently touching his son's tiny hand. "I hoped for it," he admitted. "From the moment I saw your courage, even in your fear, I knew you were remarkable. I just had to wait for you to heal, to find your strength again." "You helped me find it," Elizabeth said. "You showed me what real love looks like. And you showed me what real courage is," Daniel replied, kissing her forehead. "We found each other when we needed it most, and that's a blessing I'll never take for granted." As little Thomas grew, so did the ranch and the school. By his first birthday, The Grayson Ranch had become one of the most prosperous in the territory, known for its fair treatment of workers and progressive practices. Elizabeth expanded the school to include adult education in the evenings, teaching reading and arithmetic to ranch hands and neighboring farmers who had never had the opportunity to learn. Daniel supported her efforts wholeheartedly, often joining the classes himself to set an example for his men. In the spring of 1882, they welcomed a daughter, Sarah, named for Daniel's sister. Thomas, now a sturdy toddler, was fascinated by his baby sister, bringing his toys to share with her even though she was too young to play. One evening, as the children slept and Daniel and Elizabeth sat on the porch watching the sunset, Daniel took her hand. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out if I hadn't ridden through town that night?" Elizabeth leaned against his shoulder. "Sometimes. But I prefer to think it was meant to be, that no matter what path we took, we would have found each other eventually." Daniel smiled. "I like that thought." He kissed the top of her head. "When I said that was the very last time, I meant it with all my heart. I couldn't bear to see you hurt." "I know," Elizabeth replied softly. "And you've kept that promise every day since. You've shown me that love doesn't hurt, it heals, it strengthens, it uplifts." They sat together as the stars came out, the sound of night birds calling across the desert. From tragedy had come triumph, from pain had come healing, from fear had come courage, and from two broken paths had come one shared journey, stronger for the joining, richer for the contrast between what had been and what could be. Elizabeth Grayson, once beaten and afraid, now sat tall and proud beside the man who had helped her rebuild her life. Not as a savior or a protector, but as a partner, an equal, a beloved companion on life's journey. And as they watched the moon rise over the desert, their children sleeping safely inside, their home a beacon of warmth and love in the vast Arizona night, they knew with absolute certainty that the best chapters of their story were still being written, page by precious page, day by cherished day.